Tinseltown once promised immortality, and for a time, it delivered, through glittering close-ups, flawless faces, and timeless beauty. But behind the curtain, many of Hollywood's Golden Age legends waged silent wars against time. What resulted weren't just altered appearances, but shattered careers, stolen confidence, and haunting regrets. These are the stories of 15 iconic stars whose plastic surgery didn't just change their faces, it changed their fate. 1. Bert Reynolds. At the peak of his fame in the 1970s, Bert Reynolds wasn't just a box office king, he was a masculine ideal. With his rugged good looks, trademark mustache, and devil-may-care smirk, Reynolds could command a scene without uttering a word. But as he aged into the 1980s, Reynolds became increasingly self-conscious about the physical toll of his stunt-heavy work and the unforgiving Hollywood lens. Initially, his cosmetic interventions were justified. A serious jaw injury from a film shoot and chronic pain from football injuries prompted necessary corrective surgeries. But what began as medical soon veered into the aesthetic. Around the mid-1980s, Reynolds underwent an upper eyelid lift, a procedure intended to rejuvenate his eyes, but one that tragically altered the very feature that defined his charisma. The once hooded, smoldering gaze was replaced by a wide-eyed, almost startled look that disoriented longtime fans. Soon after came a lower facelift that reshaped his strong jawline, giving his face a tight, glossy appearance. Directors who had known exactly how to light Reynolds in the past now struggled to capture his altered expressions. His natural magnetism, once conveyed in a sly glance or sardonic eyebrow raise, had been muted. The changes became unmistakable when Evening Shade premiered in 1990. The rugged sex symbol was nearly unrecognizable. Reynolds later confessed in his memoir, "I should never have had surgery. If I could do it again, I wouldn't." He lamented the loss of his gaze, saying, "That expression, that was my identity." Though he earned critical acclaim in Boogie Nights and an Oscar nomination, the leading man offers no longer flowed. Reynolds' body aged, but it was his surgically altered face that made him obsolete to the image-obsessed machine he once ruled. His story is a cautionary tale of chasing youth only to lose yourself in the mirror. 2. Doris Day. Doris Day was sunshine personified. With her wide, joyful smile, clear singing voice, and girl-next-door charm, she captivated audiences from the 1940s through the 1960s. But in an industry that worshipped youth, even Day, known for her wholesomeness, wasn't immune to the creeping insecurity that comes with aging in front of a camera. Unlike others who rushed into surgery, Day was cautious at first. In her 40s, she had a light facelift and minimal eye work, subtle tweaks aimed at preserving her appearance without disrupting her expressiveness. But as she transitioned to television in the 1970s with The Doris Day Show, the pressure mounted. Audiences expected her to remain eternally fresh-faced, and Day herself began to believe the illusion was worth preserving. A more intensive facelift followed, one that pulled the skin around her cheeks and jaw too tightly. Dental work and lip reshaping added to the transformation. Her once animated smile became rigid, and her bright expressions, so central to her comedic and dramatic timing, grew noticeably restrained. The most painful loss was around her eyes. In her film Heyday, Day's eyes radiated warmth and sincerity, but surgery left the skin taut and unnatural. Close-ups, which once highlighted her sparkle, became awkward. Lighting crews reportedly struggled to film her face without producing glare due to the glossy, overly stretched skin. By the show's final seasons, Day had grown increasingly self-conscious. Her facial movements didn't flow the same way. Though she never publicly acknowledged the procedures, friends noted her quiet regret. She turned away from acting altogether in 1973. Doris Day's decision to alter her appearance was driven not by vanity, but by the crushing expectation to remain forever youthful. In the end, the effort to preserve her charm unintentionally blunted it, leading one of Hollywood's brightest lights to dim herself out of frame. 3. Elizabeth Taylor. Elizabeth Taylor was more than a movie star. She was a living goddess. With her dazzling violet eyes, sculpted cheekbones, and regal presence, she didn't just walk into a scene, she owned it. Her beauty was so iconic it seemed untouchable. But time, pressure, and personal insecurities led even Liz to make changes that ultimately dulled her divine glow. Taylor largely avoided cosmetic surgery in her early years. Even into her 40s, she relied on her natural features to carry her through roles in red carpets. But by the mid-1980s, as she approached her 50s, the world's most famous face began undergoing a series of procedures that would subtly, but irreversibly, change her legacy. Her most significant transformation came from a facelift that lifted her signature almond-shaped eyes into a more rounded, startled appearance. The famous high-arched brows were pulled further upward, altering the gaze that had once seduced millions in Cleopatra and Cat on a hot tin roof. Subsequent surgeries focused on her jaw and neckline, giving her a shiny, taut look that didn't read well under studio lighting. Directors and cinematographers who once marveled at how her face absorbed light like a diamond now struggled with the way her new features reflected it unnaturally. Perhaps the deepest loss wasn't physical, but emotional. Taylor's performances had always depended on the subtlest flickers, an arch of the brow, a shift in the corner of her eye. But surgery had limited her facial mobility, making nuanced acting more difficult. By the 1990s, Taylor's appearance was so changed that younger fans could hardly recognize her as the sultry star of old. Though still magnetic in interviews and charity work, especially for AIDS awareness, she was no longer the cinematic siren of yesterday. In chasing youth, even Hollywood's most perfect face had become a mask of its former self. 4. Gary Cooper. Gary Cooper wasn't just a movie star, he was the embodiment of the American man. Quiet, strong, and ruggedly handsome, Cooper's appeal lay in his natural, weathered look. He didn't need polished features or dramatic expressions. His face told stories all on its own. But in a cruel twist of Hollywood irony, Cooper's attempt to preserve his youth ultimately erased the very essence of his screen persona. As Cooper entered his 60s in the mid-1950s, the pressure to remain viable as a romantic lead, often cast opposite much younger actresses, pushed him toward cosmetic enhancements. His early surgeries were relatively conservative, a small eyelid lift, a bit of tightening around the neck. But it wasn't enough. Hollywood wanted its cowboys youthful. In 1957, Cooper opted for a more extensive facelift, one that flattened his expressive brow and removed the character-defining lines that had made him believable as a world-weary marshal in High Noon. The most damaging decision was an aggressive eye lift. Cooper's famously hooded eyes, full of gravitas and mystery, were lifted into an unnaturally wide shape, stripping away the quiet power they once held. Directors who had depended on his subtlety now found him harder to frame. Cinematographer Floyd Crosby once said, "The soul in his eyes was harder to find." Close-ups no longer carried the same weight. His expressions, once filled with restrained emotion, looked oddly frozen on camera. In his final film, The Naked Edge, critics noted that Cooper seemed preserved, a euphemism for an actor who looked off. What they didn't know was that the emotional range he once displayed had been surgically restricted. Gary Cooper's downfall wasn't due to a lack of talent or effort. It was a loss of authenticity, the kind that comes when an actor's most vital tool, his face, is reshaped by fear rather than faith. 5. Joan Crawford. Few stars in cinema history projected power and poise like Joan Crawford. With her strong cheekbones, commanding eyes, and ferocious drive, she created an image of feminine strength that dominated Hollywood for decades. But that very strength became a prison in her later years, one that led her to surgical decisions that would cost her emotional expression and ultimately her career. Crawford's cosmetic journey began in her 40s with minor adjustments, tightening the jaw, trimming the eyelids. Nothing dramatic at first, but as she moved into her 50s, the procedures became more frequent and more aggressive. Hollywood's obsession with youth was merciless, especially for actresses known for glamour. Her most drastic alterations came in the 1960s. A series of brow lifts left her with permanently arched eyebrows in a fixed position of surprise or irritation. What had once been her defining feature, those sculpted, dramatic brows, now sat too high, robbing her face of nuance. Further facelifts added to the problem. Her cheeks grew taut. Her skin reflected light in unnatural ways, creating harsh shadows on set. Lighting crews struggled to soften her face with filters and makeup, but there was no masking what had been lost. When she starred in Whatever Happened to Baby Jane, audiences were shocked by her transformation. Though the grotesque look was fitting for the character, reviewers noted that Crawford's facial movement was oddly rigid. Director Robert Aldrich later admitted he had to frame her carefully, knowing her expression had become difficult to read on camera. In her final performances, Crawford's trademark ability to telegraph deep pain and strength through a single glance had vanished. She once said, "If you want to see the girl next door, go next door." But by trying to outpace time, Crawford had made her own house unrecognizable. 6. John Wayne. John Wayne, the Duke, wasn't just a man, he was a myth. Towering, gruff, and unapologetically masculine, Wayne became the blueprint for the American hero. His squinting glare, slow drawl, and weathered skin were so distinctive, so iconic, that they seemed untouchable. But even Wayne couldn't escape the Hollywood expectation to remain ageless. By the late 1950s, Wayne was well into his 50s, but still expected to play rough-and-tumble leading men. Paired with actresses decades younger, the discrepancy became more obvious with each film. Studio executives began pressing him to freshen up his image, especially as television introduced younger faces to compete with established legends. Wayne first submitted to a conservative neck tightening and minor eyelid lift, but by the mid-1960s, just before shooting True Grit, he agreed to a more dramatic facelift. The procedure smoothed out his jaw and pulled back the skin around his eyes. While it may have bought him a few more years of youthful appearances, it came at a steep price. His squint, the rugged, unbothered glare that had become his signature, was altered. What once looked like sun-hardened resolve now appeared like an awkward strain. Cinematographers who once relied on his expressive stoicism now had to work around awkward angles and lighting to restore the grit that surgery had erased. Longtime collaborator Howard Hawks lamented in private, "The soul in his face went somewhere, and it didn't come back." Critics noted that Wayne seemed stiffer in his later roles, not understanding that surgery had physically diminished his range. Even his trademark smile lost its asymmetry, replaced with a symmetrical but hollow expression. Wayne's tragic irony was this: his appeal came from looking like a man who had lived hard. By trying to erase the signs of that life, he lost part of what made him believable. The rough terrain of his face had told stories. When it was smoothed out, the legend faded just a little. 7. Judy Garland. Judy Garland's transformation wasn't her idea. It was the studio's. At just 16 years old, the teenage phenom behind The Wizard of Oz was told her face needed fixing. Her nose, her teeth, even the shape of her jaw, they were all declared wrong for stardom. What followed was one of the most tragic cases of forced cosmetic manipulation in Hollywood history. Garland was subjected to rhinoplasty procedures before she was legally an adult. These weren't medically necessary, they were studio mandated. MGM also outfitted her with removable dental caps and facial inserts, rubber pieces designed to reshape her cheeks and jawline during filming. She was forced to wear them for hours at a time, often while delivering high-energy performances on set. The most disturbing aspect? MGM employed a doctor to regularly press on her nose cartilage to reshape it manually. Garland would endure painful sessions weekly. None of it was optional. Her value as a star was tied to how well she conformed to the studio's manufactured beauty standards. The damage wasn't just physical. Garland began taking studio-supplied painkillers to tolerate the discomfort. Those pills soon became a dependency, setting the stage for a lifetime of addiction and mental health struggles. By the time she reached her 30s, Garland had undergone multiple surgical adjustments, each one stripping away a little more of her natural self. Directors struggled to capture the vibrant girl who once lit up the screen with every blink and smile. A Star is Born showcased her still brilliant voice and soul, but her face no longer moved with the ease and warmth it once had. In a heartbreaking interview near the end of her life, Garland reflected, "They squashed my nose. They straightened my teeth. They told me to lose weight. And then they told me I still wasn't good enough." Judy Garland's tragedy isn't just about what was changed, it's about what was stolen. Her natural face, her confidence, and ultimately her peace were sacrificed on the altar of manufactured perfection. 8. Marilyn Monroe. Marilyn Monroe is remembered as perfection incarnate, full lips, platinum curls, and a breathy voice that intoxicated the world. But Marilyn wasn't born Marilyn. She was Norma Jean Mortensen, and her iconic face was the product of both subtle and not-so-subtle surgical transformation. At the beginning of her career, Monroe was advised to undergo minor procedures. Her managers arranged for a subtle nose refinement and a chin implant to better balance her facial symmetry. At the time, these were considered enhancements, not overhauls, and initially the results were successful. Monroe's transformation into a bombshell was cinematic alchemy, raw beauty refined into star power. But by the late 1950s, the maintenance became relentless. Marilyn began receiving regular collagen injections, particularly in her cheeks and lips. Though intended to keep her looking youthful, the fillers created swelling that changed her facial movement. By the time she filmed The Misfits in 1961, directors noticed she was struggling to emote naturally. Her expressions had lost their elasticity, and lighting her face became a challenge. Makeup artists and photographers from her later shoots privately admitted they had difficulty recreating the Marilyn look. Something had shifted. Her once fluid facial movement was being replaced by stiffness. Her famous pout looked overinflated. Her cheeks held a slight puffiness that made even simple emotions harder to read. Marilyn's greatest power was her ability to convey vulnerability beneath glamour. But in her final years, as the procedures stacked up, that vulnerability became harder to access. Her on-screen magic was fading, not because her talent dimmed, but because her face no longer moved the way it used to. Tragically, she died at just 36. While her cause of death remains debated, the emotional toll of her transformation was real and devastating. Marilyn had been sculpted by the industry, adored by millions, yet privately felt she was never enough. Her legacy remains luminous, but behind the glow lies the heartbreaking truth of a woman who was reshaped to fit an image that ultimately destroyed her. 9. Mary Pickford. Mary Pickford wasn't just a movie star. She was a founding mother of Hollywood. Dubbed America's sweetheart, she captured hearts during the silent film era with her golden ringlets and youthful innocence. But behind her enduring image was a woman in quiet crisis, fighting a losing battle against time, and later, her own reflection. As she aged into her 30s, Pickford found herself typecast in youthful roles, often playing teenagers well into adulthood. Her brand was built on looking young, and the arrival of talkies only magnified the cracks in that illusion. Studios lit her differently, audiences were scrutinizing her closer, and Pickford, desperate to maintain the image that built her empire, turned to cosmetic surgery. Her first procedures were relatively restrained, a soft eyelid lift and minor work on her jawline, but by the mid-1930s, her interventions grew more extreme. The most damaging occurred in 1939, when she underwent an aggressive facelift. The result was a face that no longer moved as it once did. Her natural warmth, expressed through subtle shifts in expression, was now locked behind taut skin. She had hoped for a triumphant return to the screen, but test footage revealed a haunting truth. The expressive girl who could command a silent frame with a glance was gone. Directors couldn't shoot her in close-up. Her face no longer conveyed the emotional nuance that had made her famous. Devastated by the results, Pickford quietly withdrew from public life. She declined offers, shunned cameras, and retreated into her Beverly Hills estate Pickfair. When the Academy awarded her an honorary Oscar in 1976, she accepted it from home, refusing to attend, aware that the world would no longer recognize the sweetheart they once adored. Those who visited her in later years described a woman still elegant, still gracious, but with a face that looked strangely preserved, caught in a frozen attempt to hold on to a time that had long since passed. Mary Pickford's story isn't just about surgery, it's about identity. She wasn't trying to change who she was trying to stay who she had been. But in doing so, she lost both. 10th. Mickey Rourke. In the 1980s, Mickey Rourke wasn't just considered handsome, he was devastating. With a brooding intensity and smoldering good looks, he quickly became a critical darling and a cultural heartthrob. 9.5 Weeks, Diner, Angel Heart. His performances weren't just memorable, they were electric. But few could have predicted the transformation that followed, nor the tragic reasons behind it. Unlike others on this list, Rourke's descent into cosmetic chaos didn't start with vanity. It started with violence. In the early 90s, he returned to boxing, a sport he had loved before fame. The ring didn't love him back. He suffered numerous injuries, broken noses, shattered cheekbones, a severely torn tongue. His face took repeated beatings, and his once chiseled profile was reduced to swelling and scar tissue. Rather than accept the damage, Rourke sought reconstruction, and that's where the spiral began. The surgeries were meant to restore him, but they didn't. He later admitted that he went to the wrong guy to put his face back together. One procedure after another, 5 nose jobs, cheek reconstruction, lip work, each left him looking more distant from the man he once was. His eyes, once intense and expressive, became sunken. His jawline looked unnaturally smooth. His facial proportions shifted, giving him a permanently swollen, startled appearance. Casting directors who once clamored for him suddenly stopped calling. The sensual, damaged, dangerous appeal that had defined him was gone. For nearly a decade, Rourke disappeared from major film roles. It wasn't until Sin City, where heavy prosthetics hit his face, and The Wrestler that he experienced a brief resurgence. But the damage was permanent. The boyish rogue Hollywood once crowned had been surgically buried. Today, Rourke is candid about his regrets. He speaks with bitterness about trusting the wrong surgeons. And when you see the before and after photos, it's heartbreaking. Not because he looks different, but because you can see the cost of trying to undo damage through more damage. His case is a stark reminder. When identity is tied to your face, even necessary reconstruction can turn into irreversible reinvention. 11. Tony Curtis. Tony Curtis was pure movie star magic. With matinee idol looks, charm to spare, and comedic timing that rivaled the best, he became one of the most recognizable faces of 1950s cinema. Some like it hot, Spartacus, The Defiant Ones. He was everywhere, dazzling in dramas and comedies alike. But as Curtis aged, he made a decision that would permanently dull his brilliance. He tried to freeze time with a scalpel. Curtis began dabbling in cosmetic surgery in the late 1960s. At first, it was subtle, a minor eyelid lift here, a jawline touch-up there. But as roles began slipping away and the leading man offers dried up, Curtis grew more aggressive in his pursuit of youth. By the mid-1970s, he had undergone a significant facelift that radically altered his signature expressions. His famously expressive eyes were now encased in taut skin that limited movement. His smile lines, once warm, deep, and central to his allure, were erased. The man who had lit up screens with a playful glance now looked stiff and overly preserved. Billy Wilder, who directed him in Some Like It Hot, once remarked privately, "Tony's face doesn't move the way it used to. And in this business, that's a problem." His facial mobility had been sacrificed for smoothness, and the cost was his believability. Where once he was the witty rogue or charming con man, now directors weren't sure how to cast him. As his features changed, so did the roles. Curtis found himself relegated to TV cameos, low-budget films, and supporting parts that didn't require close-ups. He later admitted he had gone too far. In a candid interview, he said, "There's a line, and I crossed it. I was so afraid of aging, I forgot how to just be myself." The saddest part? His talent never left. In independent films and smaller projects, he still delivered compelling performances, but his altered appearance made it hard for audiences to see the man they once adored. Tony Curtis didn't lose his craft. He lost the familiar mask that made the world fall in love with him. 12. Montgomery Clift. Before 1956, Montgomery Clift was considered one of the most hauntingly beautiful men to ever appear on screen. His roles in A Place in the Sun and From Here to Eternity showcased not only his good looks, but a vulnerability that no leading man had ever dared to reveal so openly. His performances were raw, emotionally intimate, and profoundly human. Then came the crash. One night, leaving a dinner at Elizabeth Taylor's home, Clift drove into a telephone pole. The accident shattered his jaw, broke his nose, and caused severe facial nerve damage. Taylor famously rushed to his wrecked car, pulling broken teeth from his throat to keep him from choking. The damage was catastrophic. The reconstructive surgeries that followed were medically necessary, not cosmetic, but their impact on his career was just as profound. His once symmetrical face now bore the marks of trauma. The left side of his face was partially paralyzed. His jawline was altered. His smile, once gentle and charming, now appeared forced and uneven. Directors could no longer film him from all angles. Cinematographers had to find his good side, limiting the freedom he once had in his performances. Clift adapted because he was still a genius, but the camera, so intimately tied to his emotional expression, no longer captured him the same way. In Raintree County, filmed post-accident, fans noticed the difference immediately. By The Misfits and The Defector, the signs of physical limitation and emotional wear were clear. Still, he fought through it, earning an Oscar nomination for Judgment at Nuremberg, but the toll was visible. Addiction, depression, and isolation followed. What makes Clift's story so heartbreaking is that his surgeries weren't elective. They were acts of survival. Yet, the very survival robbed him of the tools that had made his talent shine so brightly. Hollywood couldn't adjust to his altered face, and in many ways, neither could he. Montgomery Clift didn't fade because he lost his talent. He faded because the industry couldn't see past the scars. 13. Hedi Lamar. Hedi Lamar was often called the most beautiful woman in the world. And for good reason. Her luminous face, framed by dark curls and piercing eyes, captivated audiences in Algiers, Ziegfeld Girl, and Samson and Delilah. But Lamar was far more than a face. She was a genius inventor, co-creator of the technology that later made Wi-Fi possible. Yet, it was her appearance, not her intellect, that Hollywood valued. And as age crept in, so did her desperation to maintain her mythic beauty. In the 1960s and 70s, long after her star had dimmed, Lamar began undergoing cosmetic procedures, ones that would permanently change her. She had multiple facelifts, lip injections, cheek augmentations, and unregulated silicone injections, popular at the time but incredibly dangerous. The procedures left her face stretched, immobile, and unevenly proportioned. Her cheekbones no longer sat naturally. Her lips, once full and sensuous, appeared stiff and artificial. By the 1980s, Lamar had become almost reclusive. Once praised for a face that seemed carved by angels, she was now haunted by the results of trying to preserve it. When she was occasionally photographed, the media treated her with cruel fascination. She had gone from revered beauty to cautionary tale. Lamar later sued a plastic surgeon for botching a facial procedure, claiming he had left her disfigured. But the damage had already been done, and so had the emotional wound. She withdrew entirely from public life, refusing interviews and avoiding cameras. What's most tragic about Hedi Lamar's story is that her legacy should have been her mind, not her cheekbones. She was brilliant, bold, and ahead of her time. But like many women in Golden Age Hollywood, her body was seen as her only currency. When she tried to preserve it, it betrayed her. Lamar died in 2000, mostly forgotten by the industry she once dazzled. Her face, once her greatest asset, had become her final disguise. 14. Gloria Graham. Gloria Graham was Hollywood's ultimate femme fatale, a master of the smoldering glance and whispered seduction. In films like The Big Heat, It's a Wonderful Life, and In a Lonely Place, she brought a magnetic mixture of vulnerability and danger to the screen. But off-screen, her obsession with a single feature, her upper lip, would become her undoing. Graham was convinced her top lip was too thin. She believed it disrupted her profile, made her smile uneven, and distracted from her sultry image. So in the late 1950s, she reportedly began a series of procedures to fix it. Early attempts involved silicone injections, followed by experimental grafts using cartilage from her own body. Some rumors even suggest she used tissue from her groin. The results were catastrophic. Her lip grew swollen and stiff, losing flexibility. Directors noticed her diction suffered. Her speech became slightly slurred, her delivery less precise. Worse, her facial expressions became limited. The very tool she'd used to portray complex desire and emotional tension was now compromised. As her lip hardened, so did Hollywood's interest. The woman who once held the screen with effortless allure now seemed distorted, slightly off. Studios began casting her in fewer roles. She slipped from leading lady to supporting parts, then to television. By the 1970s, she was mostly forgotten. Graham continued to work in theater, where lighting and distance could soften the effects of her transformation. But the film industry, so dependent on close-ups, never forgave what surgery had taken away. In later years, Gloria avoided interviews about her appearance. She rarely discussed her surgeries and became intensely private. The sadness lies not only in the physical results, but in the insecurity that led her down that path. She had been a natural talent, a beauty whose slight imperfections made her memorable. But in trying to correct what wasn't broken, she silenced the very voice Hollywood once adored. 15. Mae West. Mae West was never subtle. With her bold curves, innuendos, and unapologetic sexuality, she turned the 1930s into her playground. When I'm good, I'm very good. But when I'm bad, I'm better. It was her face, cheeky smirk, arched brows, heavy lashes, that made those words iconic. But in her later years, West's fierce battle with time transformed her into something almost unrecognizable. West refused to age quietly. Even into her 70s, she maintained her bombshell image with unwavering intensity. This included multiple facelifts, heavy makeup, wigs, and an obsessive reliance on cosmetic procedures. Her face was lifted so tightly that her skin took on a waxy appearance. Her brows, once artfully arched, were now permanently elevated, locked in an expression of mild surprise. She also underwent lip work, cheek augmentation, and likely unlicensed silicone injections. The result was a face that no longer matched her natural charm. Instead, it became a theatrical mask, overdrawn, overpreserved, and eerily plastic. When she appeared in Myra Breckinridge and Sextet, audiences were stunned. The woman on screen still spoke like Mae West, still strutted and cooed, but her face didn't move with the same rhythm. Critics didn't hold back, calling her appearance grotesque and her performances unsettling. Behind the curtain, West remained fiercely defensive. She saw aging as defeat, and perhaps in her mind, the surgeries were victories, proof she could outwit time. But to many, it was clear she had gone too far. The very features that once made her irresistible had been pulled, filled, and frozen until her true essence was barely visible. Mae West's legacy is still one of power and defiance. She shattered taboos, pushed boundaries, and dared to be herself. But in her final years, the desire to remain relevant, forever desirable, led her to sculpt herself into a version of Mae West that only vaguely resembled the original. In Hollywood, beauty isn't just admired, it's demanded. For these 15 icons, the pressure to remain flawless led them down a path that didn't just change their appearance, it changed their legacy. Thank you for watching. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more true tales behind the silver screen. Until next time, stay curious and stay kind to your reflection.